Invincible Louisa by Cornelia Meigs. Chapter 7. Thoreau's Flute. In her room, looking out above the Lexington and Concord Highway, Louisa lay for weeks, wrapped in a cloud of delirium, hearing vaguely the sounds which came up from without as the long battle went on within. She heard sleigh bells at first, then crows cawing, then robins singing. The fields were all white with deep drifts the day that she was brought into the house. The Mayflowers were in bloom on the hillside, the morning when she came weakly to the door again and looked abroad upon the world. Thin, shaky, and with shorn hair, she was scarcely recognizable, even to herself, when she looked into the glass. The days between her homecoming and that staggering walk to the door were like a bad dream. But they were over. She need never think of them again. Two things of importance had happened in that interval. One was the intensely happy event of a domestic nature. Bronson Alcott, one cold, wet day in March, came down from Boston, making something in the nature of a triumphal progress. He had a piece of news to tell, which he communicated at once to the stage driver as he climbed into the creaking coach. "I am a grandfather. Anna has a son." The driver, an old acquaintance, was delighted and congratulated him warmly upon his honors. Such of his fellow passengers as he knew, and he knew most of them, were also favored with the splendid intelligence. As he dismounted from the stage to walk home, he met Mr. Emerson. It was glorious to be able to tell his old friend these good tidings. "Anna has a fine boy." He could not stop long to discuss the great event, however, since those at home at Orchard House did not yet know of it. He burst in, waving his umbrella, wet with the rain and snow, shining with joy as he announced, "Anna has a boy." He was met, as usual on such occasions, by a chorus of delighted feminine outcry, so that he could scarcely compete the announcement with the proper formula. Mother and child both doing well. Mrs. Alcott shed tears. May glowed. Louisa exclaimed in indignation that she had been defrauded. And where was her namesake, Louisa Caroline? Decision was immediately made that Mrs. Alcott should go to visit the baby and that May could manage the housekeeping while she was gone. This being March, Louisa was just beginning to sit up. Her hair had commenced to grow again, making short curls all about her head. Although she had no trace of vanity, she had sadly discovered one weak point in her nature. She was almost inconsolable over the loss of her hair. "My one beauty," she had always described it. No light vow was it, that which she had made when she was so much younger, that if the family fortunes did not mend, she would sell her hair. Now, after some real lamentations, she decided that though she had not been able to lay down her life for her country, fortune had deigned to accept the patriotic sacrifice of her hair. With this thought, she began to be comforted. It was a tonic to her to feel and to share the joy over Anna's angel as they fell to calling the baby. Through all of Louisa's illness, her mother had been so anxious. Her father, Louisa described as being completely worn out with taking care of her. Either her father or her mother had been with her every minute of the weeks she lay so near to death. Now the whole household took on a triumphant tone as it talked and exulted out over the arrival of the new member of the family, for whom Louisa, since Louisa Caroline was not to be an appropriate title, had suggested the name of Amos Minot Bridge Bronson. May Sewell Alcott Pratt. It can be seen that the family connection was large and loyal. In the end, a compromise was made and the baby was called Frederick Alcott Pratt. Louisa's first activity was a little sewing for this most wonderful of all babies. She was still really ill, since all her powers were so completely gone that it was to take a very long time to recover them. So weak and worn out was she that she had not even the spirit to be impatient, but moved feebly about, managing to be busy by the hour at small tasks which she would once have tossed aside in 5 energetic minutes. By April, she was able to drive and even walk a little in the garden and along the road under the apple trees. The family's dear friend, Henry Thoreau, had died during the winter. In one of the rare quiet hours of her night watching at the hospital, Louisa had composed some lines on the death of this shy genius whom they all loved so dearly. In the stress of what came later, she forgot them, but now as she began to awake to real living and thinking, they came back to her. She wrote them down, but showed them to nobody. It has been said the old hillside house, not far from the dwelling of the Alcotts, belonged to the Hawthornes, long-standing friends of theirs, as well as of Thoreau's. Julian Hawthorne tells of a warm summer evening when, as they sat inside, they heard light steps on the porch and a rustle at the door. No one knocked or rang the bell, so they sat for a few minutes, wondering who might be there. On his going to the door finally, he found a folded paper thrust under the crack, and no person in sight. He brought it in to his father, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and they opened it together. It was Louisa's poem on Thoreau's Flute, which she wanted them to see but was too shy to bring openly. She always made verses rather freely, but this vein of real poetry was rarely touched, and only on occasions when some great feeling had stirred her. The last was upon the death of John Brown. A little later, Mrs. Hawthorne showed the lines to the editor of The Atlantic, who published them as a tribute to the man for whom all of them were mourning. After the magazine came out, Bronson Alcott was one day in the study of his friend Henry Wadsworth Longfellow at Cambridge. "Just see," said Longfellow, getting out The Atlantic, in which contributions at the time were published without names. "I want you to read this poem by Emerson on Thoreau." "Louisa wrote that," returned Bronson in a fine glow of fatherly pride. Emerson, at that time, was thought to be one of the foremost writers in America, so that Bronson's pleasure was excusable. It is no wonder that some of Louisa's best work resembled Emerson's. Had he not taught her much of what she knew? She said once that she owed most of her education to these two men, Emerson and Theodore Parker. The second event of importance, which had come about while she was ill, had to do with her writing. Her letters home had been so interesting that while she was still at hospital, extracts were shown to a Mr. Frank B. Sanborn, who was editor of a paper called The Commonwealth. He was so much impressed by what Louisa had written that he straightway put the letters into print with the title Hospital Sketches. Kit and Billy, John Sully, and Sergeant Bain became familiar figures to many besides the immediate Alcott family. Everyone at just that time wanted to know about the hospitals and how fathers and brothers would fare if taken there. Louisa had told of the life with extraordinary effect, for she was not straining after romance now, but had given the truth simply, graphically, and with great spirit. The jokes were made more of than the pathos, the courage more than the suffering. She had managed to make each man stand out, nevertheless, Kit most of all. Kit, whom she knew only through Billy's tearful story, had brought her first real success. People were reading hospital sketches everywhere, and the Commonwealth was asking for more. Her family told Louisa of all this, while she was still too ill really to understand it. Her mind was too weak to take in such news, and she simply did not believe it. That she should be turning out to be a real writer, the sort of writer of whom people talked and for whose work they clamored, that could never be. She was only worn-out Louisa Alcott, a total failure. When she got a little better, however, she thought more about the strange news. It could hardly be true, yet it was pleasant to credit it. Just for a little while, she had no feeling that she ever wanted to write again. But presently, as she became stronger still, and the requests for more of hospital sketches were unceasing, she made the effort to complete them, to tell all she knew about her friends, the cheery Irishman and Sergeant Bain and big German Fritz. She wanted people to understand fully that all the heroism was not on the battlefield. The war dragged on, with the long, depressing, indeterminate campaigns on both sides. She could read the papers and see in the accounts what others did not. She could picture how, after each battle, the wounded would come streaming in, tired, unfed, untended, each man with his own suffering and his own need. How hard it was that she should not be there to do what she, at such cost, had learned how to do. At first, she said that when she got better, she would apply for a place in a hospital again, this time in one of the newly formed establishments for colored regiments. She had not forgotten her strong partisanship with Negroes. She had been a little astonished at first when she saw in Washington a very different sort of colored people from those hard-working, thrifty souls who had accomplished their freedom and established residence in the North. These light-hearted children of bondage were something very new to her experience. She would look at the small army of serving women who came into the hospital in the morning, some big and slatternly, some little and trim, several usually, and I apologize, this is Kent Kentley speaking. I am going to use a racial slur, usually with a pickaninny or two hanging out at their skirts. All of them gay and laughing and friendly. All day there would come up from the laundry in the basement the smell of steam and soap suds, and the unending clatter of cheerful talk. And again, this dialogue is going to get a little bit racist, and I apologize for that. There were small black imps who ran errands in the hospital, up and down the stairs, or from building to building, the Civil War substitute for the telephone system. They would steal anything the moment the owner's back was turned, but they were always cheerily obliging and good-natured. She was not shocked by any of them, and grew to feel that, novel as they were to her, she understood them. So the racist commentary is probably the author's and not Louisa Alcott's. I would assume that the terms I used were probably fairly common even 90 years ago in 1934, but we'll return to the narrative. When she realized, finally, that she would never be strong enough for nursing again, she had another plan. She took up the idea of volunteering to teach in one of the schools which the government was organizing for contrabands, as the freed Negroes were coming to be called. But once more she was obliged to admit she was still powerless to carry out any such purpose. The lowering, hovering anxiety which war brings, and from which no one could ever escape in those dark days, did not make it an atmosphere in which it was easy to get well. There is something about war which makes people feel that it is going to last forever. 4 years, it is true. 4 years, was it true that it had only been that much, when it seemed like a lifetime? It seemed scarcely possible to think what the days would be without torturing suspense, without continual dread of bad news. It was not within the power of anyone's imagination to picture troops marching home, hundreds of them whole and safe, instead of marching away to that imminent prospect of violent death. But yet the impossible finally happens. There came the news of the surrender at Appomattox, and the nightmare was over. The men were coming home. They came marching down the Lexington Road on a hot afternoon, the drums beating with a different message, the flags flying to the wind of victory, and the very sound of their feet was triumphant happiness. Even though the tramp was muffled in the thick dust, everyone turned out to see them come. The young Hawthorns ran over to the orchard house as a better point of vantage to see them pass. The Alcotts had prepared gallons of lemonade and gigantic supplies of plum cake. The tired, thirsty soldiers were allowed to fall out before the gate and were royally entertained. Louisa stood talking to the captain, as two veterans will, comparing war experiences and discussing common acquaintances. The afternoon sun was getting low when finally the command was given to fall in and march onward. The last glass of lemonade was hastily swallowed. The last thanks were stammered as the men hurried out into the road. Louisa stood at the gate to watch them go. Suddenly, just as they were all in line and ready to march away, a cheer broke out, which lifted and rang and echoed against the wooded hill. A cheer for Louisa. These men, too, knew that not all the heroism had been found on the battlefield. They tramped away, wrapped in a cloud of sunlit golden dust, and Julian Hawthorne came up to speak to Louisa. He fell back abruptly. Not in all his life before had he seen tears on Louisa's face. Even her family had seen her weep on only the rarest of occasions, but she was weeping now, as she turned away and walked into the house. Upon a person of Louisa's nature, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln was bound to make a deep and agonizing impression. It was a desperate day when the whole nation, wild with joy at the thought of peace, was plunged into inconsolable grief over the death of the great president. It seemed so needless a calamity, and yet it was an event growing out of the very nature of war, out of 4 years of violence and bloodshed, 4 years of excited and hysterical thinking. Louisa remembered from her time in Washington how people talked everywhere of how heedless Lincoln was of his own safety, how he avoided his guards whenever it was possible and went unprotected and without fear. She knew also how bitterly and terribly he had been criticized and accused, how people in the exasperation of disappointment and suffering let themselves think that everything was the fault of one man, and that man, Lincoln. Such accusations, focused at last in one excited brain, grew to the frantic idea that Lincoln was a tyrant and must be made away with. It was the last flaming up of the evil forces of the evil fires of fraternal hate. No, it wasn't. Louisa recorded her belief in Lincoln, even at a time when almost no one believed in him. She had sympathized so completely with his plans for educating the thousands of slaves to the new duties of freedom, and had wanted to share in them. It was heartbreaking for her, and for all who thought as she did, to see those hopes brought utterly to an end. Throughout the later time of the war and of this sudden sorrow, through her slow gathering of strength so completely broken, she had comforted herself to a certain degree by her writing. It was many weeks after her return home before she felt like taking up her pen, but such was the insistence of the demand that when she finally did turn herself to her old work, she continued it. After she had completed the papers wanted for the Commonwealth, she began to write stories about the war. The interest in the hospital sketches brought a greater demand for her tales than she found it possible to supply. She commenced a new series of papers in the Commonwealth, and suddenly stopped in the middle because she felt utterly dissatisfied with them. She realized that she was not doing her best, yet how to find the best she had no idea. She did not know yet that her field of writing was what was real, not what was imaginary. The immediate appreciation of hospital sketches might have shown her this, but she did not see it. She was puzzled and being still not well, she was greatly cast down and unhappy. 2 publishers wrote to ask her for the hospital sketches to be reprinted as a book. One was James Redpath. The other, a comparatively new firm, Roberts Brothers, she did not ponder the choice long. She wrote to Roberts Brothers that she preferred another publisher and gave the manuscript to Redpath. Her guardian angel might well have wrung his hands over this decision, but he did not. He seemed merely to have contrived that the mistake should not be an irretrievable error. Hospital sketches came out as a book and were read with great interest. They were rapidly and even carelessly written, being for the most part actual letters written during the brief intervals of her nursing. Perfection of style was nothing, and vividness was everything, in the light of her purpose as she wrote. They were so timely, however, so alive and so full of just what everyone longed to know, that they reached an even broader circle of readers than had the Commonwealth. She was delighted and surprised, for she thought very little of the sketches herself. Since the publishers wished for something more, she brought from the cupboards her 2 novels, over both of which she had toiled fitfully for nearly 4 years. She showed Moods to Redpath and was told that it was too long, so she cast it aside in disappointment and began grinding away at the short stories once more. She tired easily and slept badly, and one night, while lying awake, she was seized with a plan for shortening and rearranging Moods, and rose at dawn to begin. In its more abbreviated form, it won greater favor with the publishers and was printed by Loring, appearing just before Christmas in 1864. Louisa finally came to speak of the poor book as a picked robin, seeing later that she had not improved it by her frequent changes. She liked always to remember that Henry James Sr. spoke of it with commendation, and that he and Mrs. James came to see her while she was staying in Boston for a brief visit. They asked her to dinner, and she enjoyed going. She spoke with a smile afterwards of the grave advice given her by Henry James Jr., then a very young literary youth, as she called him. Her short curly hair made her look very immature and boyish, whereas she really felt immeasurably older than the grave Henry, who was just at the threshold of his own extraordinarily brilliant career. Moods was well received for a time, but it did not have a very long life. People who had read hospital sketches wanted something rather different from Miss Alcott, who could write so truthfully and vividly about the war, a subject which, in the hands of many, brought forth only romancing and lies. As the immediate success of Moods passed, Louisa lost heart completely. She remarked finally that she was tired of long stories. that she would rather fall back on rubbishy tales for they pay best, and I can't starve on praise. It was a belief unworthy of her real powers, of her father's principles, of Emerson's teaching. It was, however, almost the inevitable state of mind of a person who has struggled bravely through months of illness, has tried to work in spite of bodily weakness, but who feels at last that nothing will ever be better. Things, just the same, were bound to be better for one of Louisa's spirit. She was a strange mixture of impetuousness and toiling perseverance, of wild, impossible fancies and practical sense. It was these steadier qualities which kept her struggling forward during those dreary months when health seemed impossibly far away. Time, however, the great element in such illness as hers, did finally do its work. The summer after the appearance of moods, the summer after peace came, she was really better at last. She could see the world suddenly with clearer and more reasonable eyes. She sighed less for the unattainable plans she had made for serving her country further, and began to take firmer hold of her real occupation. It was very stimulating to have 2, and finally 3 companions, and various magazines asking her for work, when, once everything that she could write had begged its way from one publishing door to another, she still could not work for very long hours at a stretch. But she sat in the orchard house garden, on a bench which her father had built about the great elm, and fell to dreaming once more, vigorous, constructive dreams, of the former Louisa variety. Like all people when they are ill, she had been thinking only of the difficult present and not of the future. Now, as she began to feel something like real strength again, she fell to wondering what was before her. She had thought of herself as such a failure, but perhaps, after all, there were still worlds for her to conquer. And that is the end of chapter 7.